Hello, everyone. Can you hear me? I'm seeing nods and thumbs up. This is wonderful news. So welcome to the third of our SEPAD webinars, the events that are taking place in lieu of our conference, which was sadly postponed from earlier this year due to COVID-19. I'm really excited that we've been able to pull this together, though. So once again, a huge thanks to the SEPAD team for their efforts in working through the logistical issues of putting something like this together. A huge thanks to all of you for joining us today. It's wonderful to see so many people joining us remotely from all parts of the world to listen and take part in discussions about what is really a central issue in understanding the contemporary Middle East and reflecting on sectarianism and the interaction between sectarianism and international relations, which has been such a prominent part of what we've been trying to do with SEPAD, bridging in many ways two different levels of analysis and also a range of different disciplinary approaches to the study of sectarianism and to the study of the international relations of the Middle East. So I'm absolutely delighted that we have four stellar panelists for you today, four globally recognized experts on Syria and on sectarianism. They're all going to be talking for about 15 minutes, and after that we'll have time for a discussion. Just a little bit of housekeeping. If you have questions, may I ask you to ask your questions in the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen. If you've got those burning questions, put them in there, and then my job as chair is to work through those, and we'll hopefully get a wide range of questions from a disparate group of people covering all manner of topics pertaining to Syria, the Syrian conflict, and the international relations of Syria. So I'll ask you to do that. Participants, panelists, if for whatever reason your internet goes, I'll ask you to switch off your video screen and continue. So that way we should manage to go through the event without too many hiccups. So I guess all that remains for me to do right now is just introduce the panelists. I believe they themselves have settled on an order, or at least I've been told that they have settled on an order. So first up, we have my colleague from Lancaster, Dr. Rahaf Aldoughli. Rahaf is a lecturer in Middle East politics at Lancaster and a SEPAD fellow. Then we have Ali Aljasem. Ali is a researcher looking at paramilitary groups in Aleppo at the Center for Conflict Studies at Utrecht University. And then this is where it gets a little bit complicated because I don't know who's next. I don't know if it's Chris or Ugur. So I will introduce Chris first, just as I mentioned his name. Chris is reader in international relations, Christopher Phillips, I should say, reader in international relations at Queen Mary University, London. He's obviously the author of the fabulous The Battle for Syria, and a new version is coming out in the not too distant future. And then last but certainly no means least, Ungor is professor of Holocaust and Genocide Studies at the NIOD Institute in the University of Amsterdam. It's looking at research on mass violence in the Middle East. So we've got a wide range of topics to be discussed today pertaining to Syria and what's going on in the Syrian crisis. I'm really looking forward to it. I'm sure you are too. So, halas, enough of me. And I guess we will go over to Rahaf to kick us off. Rahaf, over to you. Thank you. You may need to unmute yourself.
Okay, yeah, sorry. So yeah, I was, hi everyone, and thanks for all the people who joined us today. And thanks Simon and all the PhD fellow students for helping in setting this up, and to you and to SEPAD in general. So I'm not going to share any slides. You're going to put up with my face for the next 20 minutes, and I hope this is okay. So, I will start with the questions, asking myself, why did I embark on this research? Why I'm focusing now on sectarianism, positionality, and production of knowledge. And actually, it comes as something that it relates to my identity as a Syrian and academic at the same time. And it brings me to the beginning when I noticed myself that when I'm speaking to some Syrians, I use certain terms, and when I'm writing an academic article, I'm using another term to define or frame the Syrian conflict. And this is very much relates to the standpoint of the researcher, or where he or she is standing at, or what's their reflections on the conflict. It's kind of relates to the language that they use. And so, for example, when you are talking to Syrian friends, you kind of debate the use of uprising, ahdath, events, conflict, war, or civil war. And when, for example, if you are listening to the regime, they are using certain terms to describe or frame the conflict in order to determine certain outcomes of this kind of narration. And so, so the use of these terms and get me into thinking how, when we are framing it as a sectarian conflict, what kind of how this production of knowledge, when we say that it is a sectarian conflict, play on the ground, or kind of determine certain foreign policies or certain judgmental views. Now, so it is war of terminologies, and here I'm using Assad's words. I'm not endorsing his words, but he did say that it is harb mustalahat, or war of terminologies. So the complexity of the Syrian case lies in the way state, non-state actors, regional and international powers frame its events since 2011. So it has been disputed among opposition groups, including activists, militants, whether to call it revolution, as I said, war, uprisings, ahdath, events, and it's all kind of relates to your positionality and how you want to present yourself to your audience. So it does, and here it takes two actually to accept this audience and the researcher or the speaker. So regime and packed militias have exerted their efforts actually to frame it as a clear-cut categorization as fighting or countering terrorism, extremism, and sectarianization, or sectarianism. And I will explain at the end of my talk how using or framing it as sectarianized conflict or a sectarian conflict actually empowered not only the regime, but also in the process of desectarianization that the regime is using. It's also helping the regime reviving its own authoritarian bargain. So it does depend about the angle that you are taking from, and how such a production of knowledge frame or determine certain aspects or outcomes. So when it comes to the first first factor in my talk, or what I'm talking about, so the three things: production of knowledge, framing Syrian identities as the second, and then the third one is a way of how using sectarianized language in academic field or in policy reports will kind of impact or have a detrimental impact on peace building, conflict resolution, and reconciliation. So in terms of the first factor, or the first section in my presentation, is that production of knowledge and the identity of the researcher, and it does relate to my positionality and the question, why did I embark on this research? So the question here, do we have a positional superiority when we are reading about sectarian identities? Is this abstracted, homogenized, or hegemonized? And here, I started with the need to contest this discursive production of knowledge that renders the play of sectarian identities as abstracted and lacks agency, which invite the question whether or not there is an alternative category of subaltern centered knowledge about sectarianism that it needs to emerge. So and here there is a need to decolonize the epistemic landscape, which will be through locating these hegemonic discourses that disregard other Syrian political, social, cultural, local, and tribal subjectivities from this academic narrative. And here, actually, So the research focus on sectarian identity demands forms of reflection and interpretation that are sensitive to power dynamics. And here I'm talking about the social position of the researcher, which is not really irrelevant. So the types of social positionings and background, as complex and as multi-layers they may be, unavoidably affect the extent to which we can access, understand, and the significance of framing identities. So when we come into critiquing instrumentalization of identities as it relates to sectarian identity, it's best to start by being upfront about our own positioning in this matter. And here I'm talking about the researcher's identity. So the need to consider the social identity and background of the researchers is a complex topic that can in some cases be taken to extremes. So, but however, when positionality of the researcher leads to significant interpretive omissions in the research literature, for example, it becomes readily apparent that we are not adequately examining the assumptions and the biases that such identities can produce. Now, so at this point in 21st century, when there is such widespread awareness of intersecting identities and the importance of the researcher's social positionality as it relates to knowledge productions, it's quite striking that such an important aspect of social dynamics is ignored. So I'm seeing lots of research or academic research on that impose certain sectarian or impose certain framing on Syrian identities without the researcher coming forward to talk about his or her positionality and how it relates to this research, because we are framing other identities in a way. So there is a need to critique the power knowledge nexus, which entails examination of how perpetuation of abstract rationalism in academic discourse resonates with the production of certain reductionist terminologies such as Sunni states, Sunni monarchies, Sunni Alawite regimes, Shia militias. All of these are very reductionist terms that needs to be unpacked. And actually, my approach taken here refused to accept that academic discourse and identity of the researchers are the secrets in areas of Middle Eastern studies. Now, the second point in my presentations will be talking about framing Syrian identities. And here I'm using these three words, Ta'ifi, Mutayyaf, or Tatif. Are we sectarian? And here I'm gonna use we, and I'm gonna abuse this kind of stage of saying that I'm Syrian. So are we Ta'ifi? Are we Mutayyafin, sectarianized, or the process of sectarianization Tatif? So before embarking on these three terms, and context and problematize them, let me start with a bit of history. So the creation of Syria as a nation state, it cannot be unrelated to, in post-colonial era and the turbulent history that we have, the many military coups, cannot be unrelated to the process of sectarianization and desectarianization by the regime. So the regime, when it ascended to power, baptism, when he came to power in 1970s, there was a process of ideological desectarianization or homogenizing of the Syrian communities, and this was through, for example, imposing certain secular identity on Syrian communities, where this imposed secularism did not penetrate the Syrian society, and it did not start at the grassroots level. And this process of desecularization by the Ba'ath regime was also not only through imposing secularism, but also by a way of, not only by imposing secularism, but also co-opting Sunni ulamas, confronting certain religious schools, and approaching and kind of empowering certain religious schools. So empowering certain religious schools like Sufism, it all has played a way in the survival of the regime and consolidating the state power. So, and here comes lots of debates that emerged also after the 2011 that talk about the incongruence between state identity and or the state identity and or the imagined national borders that the regime wanted to create, like because they imposed Arabism as a hegemonic ideology in the Syrian context. So there is this kind of mismatch between state identity and the imagining of the nation that the regime was trying to do, and these all kind of, as Hinnebish always say, that this created the rise of sub-state identities and suprastate identities at the same time. So, but the regime, what they tried to do during the 1990s, they started to sacrifice or a little bit loosen their narrative about Arabism, and they started to think that, okay, well, we need to propagate a kind of a state identity, Syrian state identity. But rather than creating a Syrian or a Syrianism state identity, what they create is Ba'athism, non-Ba'athist, or sorry, Assadist, not Assadist. And here the rise of personality cult to play a role in also imposing a certain identity on Syrians. But it was all here non-sectarian. So, and this brings me to Haddad's categorization of passive, active, passive, assertive, and aggressive, and it's actually problematic here to say that within the passive category that Haddad mentioned, that we did not really have the passive sectarian identity, but we were not, and here in the Syrian context, we don't have the Sunni Shi'i binary or the Sunni Alawi binary that very obvious, but more or less about the privileged and the privileged people. It's more about those who have power and not have power. It's rather than sectarian division or sectarian binaries, but more about power and or Ba'athist, non-Ba'athist, Assadist, non-Assadist. So and now in terms of manipulation of or instrumentalization of sectarianism in Syria, so within this, so before going into the post 2011, within back to these three terms, Ta'ifi, Mutayyaf, or Tatif. So with these three terms, there are three things that come to mind: space, time, and context. So when were you Ta'ifi? When were you Ta'ifi? How you become Mutayyaf, and how you accepted, or whether we accepted, Syrian accepted sectarianization. So when I'm reading this kind of academic research, so there are either imposed sectarian identities on Syrians without any unpacking to what Sunnism or Shiism or Alawism mean. Rather, these terms are just statistically imposed on the Syrian context. And there is lack of empowering the agency of Syrians, whether they are really categorize themselves as Sunni or not. And there is also whether the sectarianization process has really a kind of questioned whether Syrians accept this sectarianization or not. So asking this simple question does not only critique the current imposition of sectarianism on Syrian identities, but also unbend an important concept of agency, abstraction, and homogenization. And actually, just quickly, and these three words actually also encompasses the main contentious debates that tackles the production of identities within primordialism, instrumentalism, or constructivism. Now, in both Arabic and Western academia, I'm not going to go into details about who said who, but there has been a lot of emphasis on the sectarianization of these identities by regime. So it is a top-down process, or it is a geopolitical rivalry between Iran or Saudi Arabia. So, or is it because of the mismatch between state identity and the mismatch between identity and the national border? There's a lot of been talking about, so but something that is really interesting here, Harut's study, I think it's the first who kind of do an ethnographic study about whether Syria, how do Syrians envision sectarianism or their sectarian identities, and So if we say that in pre-2011 we have هوية طائفية غير مفعلة or a passive sectarian identity, then how it became activated? Is it violence? Is it violence that instigated this sectarianization or this sectarian identity, or whether there are something missed of this categorization, or what is missed from this from framing Syrian identities as sectarianized? First of all, is what is missed, I think, is the focus on dialect, the focus on space, the focus on psychology, the manifestation of sectarian identities, not through your religious sect, but through, for example, class, dress code, dialects, especially the Damascene dialect or the Qaf using the Qaf dialect, your family name, clan, and tribe. So, and also the nationalist narrative and how the nation is configured as a family, not only related to a sectarian affiliation. Okay, yeah, okay. Ali is my friend, so he's gonna accept that. I'm gonna just I'm gonna sum up just in a minute. So. And also an important thing that why there is a conceptual limitations here to using sectarianism is that we do have if we are imposing these sectarian identities on Syrians when they are fighting, we have seen many militias, especially in Ghouta and in northern Syria, who are all belong to the same sect, Sunnis, and they are fighting each other. So I don't think Sunnism really explain anything, or Shiism, and so there is also lots of contentious debates about how we define sectarianism, or what is sectarianism? Is it a feeling, belonging, loyalty, or is it national sentiments? But without really unpacking what does Sunnism mean to these communities, especially in Syria, where there's not that Sunni Shia binary, or even when it comes to Alawi, it's more about power and not anything else. Now, let me go to, and because I don't have time and I talk a lot. So there is, like, as I said, many things to talk about here, to unpack here, rather than sectarian identities. As I said, the dialect, the gender, the dress code, the history, proverbs, the media, the songs, the rhetorics. Now, let me go to the last bit, and I'm gonna finish in just 3-4 minutes. So the overriding question related to this is the sectarianized language that we use in academia, and how we de-essentialize the use of Sunnism and Shiism a little bit, or Alawites here in this context, and how the implication of this sectarianized language in academia for the future in Syria. Now, as I said, in pre-2000, so I do believe that we have two processes of desectarianization here in Syria. One which is in pre-2011, when Assad wanted to consolidate his power, and the second one is in now, what's happening. Now, by sectarianizing or imposing sectarian identities on Syria, we are a little bit going back to how in the colonial era we were categorizing communities, we were dividing communities, and here we are asking these questions about how such division of Sunnis, Shias communities, especially when you read the studies or academic studies that start with statistics about Syria, like we have 80% of Sunnis and we have 10% of Alawis. All of these are categories that really brought or invite foreign policies to divide communities, or ask the question, so do we, when we want to build peace, we divide these communities? Do we build borders among these communities? And actually another important point about desectarianization and its and especially what the regime is doing now. So in the first process of the desectarianization that the regime done is by disregarding any sects. Now, what the regime is doing in post-2011 is bringing back religion to the fore and creating, and actually not only co-opting all the religious institutions. So finally, so yes, okay, let's just, so so there is a way, so by sectarianizing the conflict in academic and policy reports, we are introducing same old power dynamics into the scene, which so for example, what the regime is doing, using religion to desectarianize the conflicts by using wajahat, traditional leaders, tribal leaders, in order to establish reconciliation and conflict resolutions. So this desectarianization process by the regime, it established not only a new authoritarian bargain that moves beyond robustness of authoritarianism or upgrading of authoritarianism, but rather bring back to the fore a more robust religious institution that is sectarianized in itself, and this is how it's done. Another thing that when we do sectarianize our academic language, we disregard the grassroots, the agency to grassroots civil society, and it brings back to the fore the generational gap between those who are on the ground and patriarchs of religions, leaders and tribal leaders that are being used and instrumentalized by the regimes. Now, in terms of the conceptual limitations, there's lots of production Syrian identities that we need now, or lots of emerging identities rather than Sunnis or Shia, but it's more about being non-religious, being European, the Syrian refugees, being Assadist or non-Assadist. So okay, yeah, I will finish. So there's a lot of identities that is emerging other than being Sunni, Shia, or Alawis. Okay, thank you very much. I'm sorry, I took over. Okay, I'm gonna mute myself.
Thank you so much, Rahaf. Really fascinating stuff, and so much to think about, and also a very nice trailer for tomorrow's discussions, which are explicitly on desectarianization. So thank you very much. You've set the scene quite nicely. So I've had a message from Ali to say that there is a change in the running order. So to aid coherence and the intellectual flow of what's happening, we're now going to go to Ugur. So the floor is yours. I will send you a private message, Ugur, just to give you a 5-minute warning. So keep an eye on that, if you will, please. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Simon. Am I audible to everybody? This makes sense? Great. Okay. Well, thank you very much for organizing this and for carrying this to the digital sphere, so we can have that conversation we were meant to be having in person. No, I come at this. I kind of entered this discussion as a historical sociologist who's interested in mass political violence, in particular in the modern Middle East, 20th and 21st centuries. And the overarching questions in the research field that I'm interested in are the causalities between collective identities on the one hand and violence on the other hand. So the discussion on sectarianism in Syria fits really well in the broader discipline that I feel that I'm embedded in. My presentation is part of it's actually a spin-off book that came out of a project on paramilitarism that ran from 2014 to 2019, which was on paramilitarism. It was a project that worked with several researchers, 2 PhD candidates. Also, Ali is one of them. And in this project, we looked at the occurrence, the emergence, and the violence of pro-state militias. And in that project, I wrote a synthesis book, which is forthcoming in about 2 months with Oxford University Press. It's titled "Paramilitarism: Mass Violence in the Shadow of the State." And as I was doing that, I was writing that book. I was supposed to be having like a final chapter in that book that was going to be on Syria, in particular the pro-state militias in Syria. Now that project got kind of out of hand, as in it grew, and it kind of became a separate spin-off project, which will be a separate book on the quote-unquote Shabiha. Now, let me walk you a little bit through the presentation that I prepared for this. And I want to start off really with the apparatus of coercion that the Assad regime was commanding at the beginning of the uprising. And there were basically 4 major categories. We have, of course, the army and the police. We have a whole range of, and this is an incomplete list of the intelligence agencies in the green bullet points. Then we have some of the special forces, so the elite fighting shock troops in the 3 blue bullet points. And then what was really interesting about the uprising and the regime response to it was the emergence of kind of irregular armed militias, semi-civilian, semi-military, that appeared in the streets of Syria and committed lots of violence against the demonstrations. And this violence was, of course, partly these were arrests. This was repression, shooting at demonstrations, but later also gradually escalated into torture, into kidnapping and massacres, large-scale massacres across Syria against the civilian support base of the uprising. And what I'm interested in really is the and how these men, these quote-unquote shabiha, this is the kind of Shami term for these militias, how they got involved in this conflict, how did they experience the conflict, and how did their violence transform Syrian society and the conflict in itself. So it's really also about the locus of kind of ethno-religious, quote-unquote, sectarian identities. And part of the book will also be about the relationship between violence and sectarianization and desectarianization. Now, for this, I used a combined approach. On the one hand, interviews with eyewitnesses, several dozens of interviews with the actual militiamen themselves, a range of social media sources and Syrian media sources from various angles. Now, and what this basically produced is a kind of patchwork research. On the one hand, you have a lot of perpetrator data, and on the other hand, you have bottom-up a wide range of victim or survivor data. And if you triangulate that properly, then you can actually paint a kind of interesting three-dimensional picture of the collective experiences of these militias. And what so far, of course, I'm writing the book right now. It should be out at the end of the year, beginning of next year. Is a kind of prosopography of the motives and experiences of a generation of mostly young men who were in their early 20s, sometimes in their early 30s, in 2011, and who were an exceptionally diverse phenomenon. So the notion or the stereotype of sectarian militia, and these two words, they really not only reduce the complexity of their membership, but also of their motives and their collective experiences. And finally, of course, their violence in the conflict. So we're kind of moving away from that notion of sectarian militia, without denying, of course, that there are significant elements both in the causality and in the violence of sectarianization, sectarian motives, sectarian collective hatred. And to do that, we looked at three sites: Aleppo, Homs, and Damascus. I know we could have chosen many other sites as well, but it's for this type of fieldwork, it's a large country. So Ali is doing, he's focusing on Aleppo. I was mostly interested in Homs, but in the book's going to be a comparative between these three cities. And what you see here really are the kind of micro-sociological foundations of Shabiha mobilization and violence. And my key argument here is that the Shabiha phenomenon is a fundamentally diverse phenomenon. It cannot be reduced to only a sectarian militia. It certainly cannot be reduced to one single factor. And to point it out, I want to look at the city of Homs in this presentation, and at the forms of violence that do not really sit well with that kind of sectarian binary narrative of the Alawites and Sunnis. And if we look at Homs, now we see here in red, you see the neighborhoods that were most active in the uprising. And in white, you see the neighborhoods that were least active or demonstrating in the uprising. And I want to point exactly at three neighborhoods, these three neighborhoods, so Zahra, Akrama, and Wadi Dhahab. And these largely Alawite neighborhoods gradually became part of a segmented city in which Shabiha mobilization emerged from these three neighborhoods, and significant violence was committed against these red neighborhoods, of course, that were most prominently in the news, like Baba Amr and Khaldiya, of course, Dir Balbe. And the mobilization and the violence against these communities were overwhelmingly Sunni communities. Most of the interviews with these militiamen, they confirm that fears of collective existence, of their collective existence, specifically in Homs, was an important motive in their mobilization. It also took me quite a number of years, actually a couple of years, to find out who was leading this effort. And we found out that a relatively obscure man by the name of Sabtar Rustam, who before was not really active in the security forces, was running as a kind of shadow commander of these militias in Homs. And in 2012, especially 2012 and 13, Homs became the scene of some of the kind of worst massacres in the Syrian conflict against civilians. And in the aftermath of these massacres, you would generally see two visuals pop up. On the one hand, you would see grief, such as the massacre of Hola, for example, the massacre of Karm al-Zaytun, in which several dozens of mostly civilians were massacred in the street. But also, you would see triumph. You would see photos like these pop up on the social media accounts of the Shabiha, and the same sites and the same places where these massacres were committed. So it was actually fairly easy to find out who these men were. Most of the violence was then, of course, narrativized as a kind of sectarian fault lines, along sectarian fault lines. These were kind of Alawite militiamen. Most of the victims were Sunni communities, rightly so. But two forms of violence were disregarded in a serious examination of violence in these 3 years. One was Shabiha violence against Alawites, and second was Shabiha infighting. And when we look at Shabiha violence against Alawites, we actually see that it's quote-unquote moderate, or those people who actually spoke up against the violence against civilians in these three neighborhoods where these mobilizations happened, is that the initial victims, actually the very first victims of the Shabiha are the Alawites in Homs who dared to speak up, against both the kind of sectarian discourse that mobilized these men and against the actual violence. And I want you to take a good look at the man with the beard who's standing almost in the middle, because he's going to come back in a minute. Now, the Shabiha gradually became more regimented. The Iranian intervention became more formalized in the National Defense Forces, Quwat al-Difa al-Watani. And gradually they kind of took over the city because, well, the regime won. And when they won the city, gradually we saw infighting emerge in the conflict, and we saw that the power of the Saqqa Rustam, who by then was the kind of the lord, the master of the city, he became challenged. He became challenged, especially by the man on the right, Khaldun Abu Ali, who at some point, one of his bodyguards, the same man with the beard that I just showed you, whose name was Abu Yaqub, who was assassinated in 2017 in broad daylight in the middle of the street. Now, this is kind of weird. The opposition fighters were all kind of gone. They were expelled. The regime had cleaned out the rebellious neighborhoods. The siege was also about to be, it was basically disbanded. And yet, here was one of the major militiamen gunned down in the middle of the street. Now, the regime, especially pro-regime media, they immediately went, "Oh, this was a shaheed, and it was the terrorists, the Sunni terrorists that killed him, etc." But interviews with his social environment confirmed actually that it was Saqqa Rustam who put a hit job on his competitor's bodyguard, so to make sure that the spoils of the war could not be divided between some of these other men. Now, this of course cannot be narrativized as easily as sectarian violence, right? So because it doesn't fit in that kind of binary narrative. Now, I want to return and give you kind of conclusions, because I think I have to gradually wrap up. I want to make 3 points. First of all, we see that
5 minutes.
Yes, that's perfect. Yeah, I can kind of drag it out a little bit.
Take your time.
All right. So my first point is, and you'll see that also in Ali's presentation, is that the Shabiha phenomenon, or actually the practice of tashbih, was a fundamentally diverse phenomenon. It is too simple to reduce this either to kind of Alawite sectarian militia or even to a minoritarian sectarian militia across the country. If we look at it quantitatively, but even if we take kind of interviews with these men seriously, because they express their motives and their kind of their kind of self-presentations. That's one point. The second point is that violence, Shabiha violence in Homs, but also across the country, really ran along 3 cleavages. One, it was of course against opposition civilians. There's no denying that the primary victims of the Shabiha were those communities that were deemed disloyal because they were involved in demonstrations, or later on, as the uprising militarized, there was activity of the Free Syrian Army or Islamist rebels. But there are two other cleavages, I think, that are also important. One is violence against loyalist civilians. So what we see, especially after 2015, as these, they're kind of dividing the spoils in the country. What we see is shabiha kidnapping, for example, of loyalist civilians for money, basically, so for ransom. And this is a really kind of interesting, complex phenomenon, because those same men that were empowered in 2011, 2012, after a while, the Frankenstein monster starts to devour its masters, and it became difficult for the regime to rein in the power of these networks. And we see, mostly in 2015, 16, the first clashes between the Syrian army and the NDF, or even between the intelligence agencies and the NDF. And a third important cleavage is, of course, violence against each other. There's a lot of kind of micro-sociological analysis that suggests that under this broad kind of emic concept of shabiha, or the kind of institutional identity of NDF, under it, local networks, actually, we see that there's significant conflict among these groups. So it's a very kind of diverse, both in its targeting of its victims and in its membership. But these two latter cleavages are often disregarded in favor of a kind of sectarianized narrative of Alawites versus Sunnis. And my third and final point is the notion that kind of collective identities or sectarian identities lead in a linear way to violence or commission of violence, of course, has been debunked in a lot of research. Much more often, anthropologists and sociologists, they argue that it's the other way around. It's actually that the commission of collective violence, very often by a small group of, relatively small group of young men, leads to the polarization of collective identities, whether that is in a village in Bosnia, or it is in a neighborhood in Gujarat, for example, in India, or in these neighborhoods in Syria and Homs. It is actually the other way around. So violence leads to sectarianization. Although I would like to argue that the relationship, in my opinion, is much more dialectical. We cannot disregard the former explanation without, of course, reducing it to an essentialist way or a reductionist way. Because the interviews so far, what we see, the interviews with these young men demonstrate that fears of their collective existence played an important role in their mobilization. Now, for the rest of the arguments, you basically have to wait for the book. But thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. So I'm very much looking forward to getting a copy of this in 2 months, do you say?
That is the conceptual book. The Shabiha book will be out probably end of the year.
Fantastic. Well, double hitter. Looking forward to both of them. So thank you so much. I will just take this moment as we're segueing to Ali as he's getting ready, just to remind everyone to put questions in the Q&A function at the bottom of your screens, please. We'll work through those after Chris's presentation, but if you've got anything that you want to remind yourself and ask, do put it in now, and then we will get to it in due course. Okay, Ali, over to you whenever you're ready.
I'm ready. Can you hear me well?
We can, thank you.
Thank you, Simon, and all SEPAD team for successfully putting this together and make this happen. Well done. So our compliments. So just to take time and not go over time, I would like to move directly into my topic, addressing my research, which focuses on the Shabiha group in Aleppo, in particular at Aleppo University. So this is a very micro level study. I'm not going to repeat what Ugur has identified or mentioned about Shabiha. So I would rather go in some theoretical debates on paramilitary groups, and then move into the empirical data that I have collected through my research. So I understand Shabiha, or the voluntary militias, as those groups who are sponsored and trained by the state and are linked to its structures in one way or another. Beyond filling the military gap of the regular armed forces and the security apparatus, paramilitary groups and pro-government militias have more capacities when it comes to local intelligence skills necessary to manage the civilian population, as Ek argues. So I use Ugur definition of paramilitary groups, where he defines the paramilitarism as a phenomenon in which a regime and its proxies of ruling elites establish irregular armed organizations that carry out violence against clearly defined individuals or groups. And this is the very case of Syria. And at their inception, such groups are loyal to the regime and their sponsors rather than to the state or its institutions. So this is what I found also in my research, with many advantages and few risks to the regime. Regimes and governments resort to such organizations for many reasons. First, they aim to delegate violence from an official institution which supposedly holds the legitimate right to use violence and force to enigmatic organizations. This way, the authorities can re-monopolize competences or even deny their responsibility to be held accountable for plausible deniability, as Alvarez and Campbell argue. Moreover, paramilitary groups are in most contexts recruited locally, and this is clear. This is very clear through Khalifa's work. So local recruits have invaluable services for the state when it comes to tribes, ethnicity, and strongmen who can be reservists and stationary bandits. A key distinguishing factor of paramilitary groups, among others, is the absence of their command structure. So official military organizations tend to be rigidly organized along regimental hierarchy, while paramilitaries are less formally structured, usually described by Linders and Costusi as hierarchical orders and structures. So paramilitary groups tend to rely on the authority of leadership, while the military and police tend to rely on the authority of position. In the context of authoritarian regimes, coercive apparatuses building depends on three strategies which can prove them. Theorized by McCarran in 2013, these strategies are first creating parallel security institutions, second, distributing material incentives selectively, and finally, exploiting the communal ties. In my research, I examine how intracommunal links of individuals play a significant role in mobilizing civilians and in particular students to oppress their fellow students and use violence against them if need be. I do this by looking at the relevant civil society organization structures, by tracking key individuals' histories and tracing their promotions within such organizations during the conflict. In the Syrian context, the Ba'ath Party first plan was the structuring of the popular organizations, or al-Munazzamat al-Sha'biyya. Their goal was to create a core of committed adherents who would be the pioneers and guardians of the Al-Ba'ath project, as Salwa Ismail argues in her book, The Rule of Violence. The organizations linked to the educational system and students, like the Ba'ath Vanguards organization, Tala al-Ba'ath, the Revolutionary Youth Federation, Shabibat al-Thawra, and the National Union of Syrian Students, or Ittihad al-Tullab, were the first to be in frame. It's worth noting that the NUS, or Ittihad al-Tullab, much like other organizations, and nepotistically and patrimonially organized, with the Ba'ath Party constitutionally leading the society and the state. Therefore, as Belen argues, patrimonial coercive apparatus is likely to be less receptive to the idea of regime change compared to the institutionalized one. So going back into history, the Syrian regime was heavily dependent on civil society organizations and syndicates, or naqabat, to mobilize the mass to support its leadership as early as it took power. However, restoring to recruiting Lijan Shabiya or popular army, Jaysh al-Shabi, or popular committees was not for military reasons initially. One of the main goals was to enhance intelligence gathering. During times of confrontations or uprisings, leaders are likely to counteract disruptions by subcontracting the task of control and repression to militias that have the local intelligence skills. Now, moving to the case or to the Shabiha of Aleppo. In Aleppo, I identified, or my research, my preliminary findings identified 3 types or networks of Shabiha, which happened or which appeared at the onset of the uprising after 2011. They might sometimes overlap with each other, considering their communication and supply channels with the security apparatuses. We have tribal militias, business militias, and party militias. My paper, however, looks only at the 3rd type, the Ba'ath-affiliated militias, which were facilitated by the Ba'ath party branches in Aleppo and its auxiliary organization, NUS, or the National Union of Syrian Students. So the NUS complex structure and its young educated members make it the most effective organization when it comes to organizing events and mobilization, because it has the necessary and sufficient resources to do so. Unlike other universities, however, in Aleppo, class and the Ba'ath loyalty are more pertinent criteria than the sectarian struggle. With the absence of the explicit sectarian rivalry like that of Homs and Latakia universities, the competition is apparent between Aleppo, the city, and its countryside, and other cities like Idlib, Raqqa, Deir Zor, where there were no full universities there. So it's a class and leverage struggle rather than a sectarian one. Going more deeply into the NUS structure, I looked at it, and it's designed to be a watchdog vertically and horizontally inside the universities. Officially, in every directorate and institution, there is a seat reserved for one of the NUS members at all levels. However, their role was and is not to lobby for student rights. They are acting like informants for the NUS leadership in Damascus. At the beginning of the protest, the NUS administrative office, which is the branch of the main executive office in Damascus at Aleppo University, formed what is called Al-Lijan al-Tulabiyya, or the students' committees, with the administrative office members' supervision. One of their first activities was forming an electronic army of trolls to promote Assad's image of a civilized leader and repel the anti-regime narrative by associating those who are calling for a protest with imperialist Western governments and by being externally funded. Bashar al-Assad explicitly thanked these, quote, young, enthusiastic, and patriotic groups for standing in the face of the conspiracy against Syria, unquote. However, the tasks assigned to the NUS were changing in line with the developments inside the campus. The main task at the beginning of the protest movement inside the university was to mobilize students to participate in rallies and prevent anti-regime protests. After a couple of weeks, the reactions of the NUS members and their recruits changed to more violent responses and strategies. In mid-2012, when the Free Syrian Army, FSA, started to gain a foothold in Aleppo, the NUS was the first organization that adopted the idea of the Ba'ath legions inside the university, whose members were mainly students and Ba'athists. So moving into the incentives and how motivations, or what motivated those groups or students to join such a group. Students were lured with many incentives and advantages on different levels. So militarily, all students who would join a pro-Assad military formation would be A, exempted from the official army conscription, B, stationed in their hometowns, C, free and unaccountable in looting whatever their hands fall on, and finally, in case of injury, militia members would be treated in the military health facilities, which is an advantage. While administratively, student members of Kata'ib al-Ba'ath formations enjoy priorities over all other students when enrolling for a new academic year, a tiring and a longer process that could take more than a week to do. Moreover, they would get a room inside the university accommodation city where only 2 out of 20 accommodation units are allocated for students. The rest are inhabited by IDPs or internally displaced people. At times of goods shortage and economic distress, militia members always have the priority to get supply. Kata'ib al-Ba'ath members, moreover, were allowed to carry weapons inside the campus, a sign of prestige and superiority felt by the gun holders inside an academic institution. So during my research, I argue or I look at the roles of key civilian individuals, and I trace some of those figures, and I focus on some. I'm going to talk about 2 personalities here. The first one is the current Assistant Central Secretary of the Syrian Central Branch of Al-Ba'ath Party, Hilal Hilal, who's number 2 after Bashar al-Assad in the Ba'ath structure. Hilal Hilal became the head of the Ba'ath Party branch of Aleppo in August 2011. In a live interview with him in November 2011, Hilal reiterated that, quote, "The Ba'ath Party has been active since day one of the crisis. However, the role of the comrade Ba'athist drifted into a more practical involvement and extended to act like a backup and an auxiliary force to the Syrian Arab army," unquote. The other person is Omar Aroub, who is a student union executive office member based in Damascus, who was rewarded a seat in the parliament in 2016 for his efforts. Aroub was the mastermind of the Shabiha recruitment at Aleppo. He's a Sunni, he's from a small town to the west of Aleppo. So he, together with Hilal Hilal, succeeded in mobilizing and assembling party members into the Ba'ath legions or Kata'ib al-Ba'ath. Just final observations, and this is a quote from a senior member of Kata'ib al-Ba'ath at Aleppo University, and it is kind of similar to the Leninian question of who will take over whom, which can better explain the nature of the relationship between the masters of violence in Damascus and violence brokers in the periphery in Aleppo. So I'm quoting him. The leadership in the capital thinks that they are the biggest winners with the minimal expenses and damage, while the new rising elites, in this case in Aleppo, see themselves, or we see ourselves, gaining great advantages by being promoted to positions we would have never thought of occupying otherwise. So my final remark is actors internal to the community played a significant role in the civilians' mobilization in the context of Aleppo. And I conclude that sectarianism was the least factor concerned in the context of Aleppo University. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Ali. Absolutely fascinating stuff. Really, really pleased that we could get you involved in this. Right, on to our final presenter, who is seated just outside of his home institution, I believe, social distancing permitting. Most of you have read his work, but over to you, Chris Phillips. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Simon. I must first of all apologise. I have one of the worst internet connections, I think, in the country at the moment. So if I cut out midway through, Simon, can you just drop me a message and I'll turn off my camera or something like that to try to make it through. What I'm going to attempt to do is share screen, share a presentation I've put together on the paper I'm going to be presenting to you. Before I start, just to sort of echo Rahaf's point about positionality, I should probably confess that I think my position within sort of the context of this panel is slightly different. I'm very much looking at the outside in rather than the inside out. I am someone who's fortunate enough to have lived in Syria for several years, but have not been there since the war began, and as a result, very much focused my research on looking at external players in the conflict. And so I must thank all my panelists before me who have all offered really detailed and thorough pictures of what's taking place inside Syria, and it's absolutely invaluable for researchers like me to be able to who look at the international side of things to be able to connect the international with that domestic scholarship. So I hope what I'm saying will be complementing what has gone before. So I've given my paper the title of Sectarianism on the Menu, which is a slightly cheeky title. It's a variation of a paper I wrote a few years ago called Sectarianism as Plan B. And it looks and compares and contrasts how both Saudi Arabia and Iran have sponsored different quote-unquote sectarian fighters in Syria's civil war. And the idea behind the title is to suggest that it is to counter some of the generalities that are made about both Saudi Arabia and Iran's involvement in the Syrian civil war with regard to sectarianism, because there is a presumption that is often made very frequently in the media, but also in several academic works, that Saudi Arabia and Iran are both sectarian actors, and therefore their engagement in the Syria conflict and their sponsorship of fighters in the Syria conflict must by necessity take a sectarian line, and the presence of sectarian fighters inside Syria must be connected to the sponsorship by these powers. And whilst I'm not denying that, the idea of it being on the menu rather than being the only dish available is an important distinction that I'm trying to make, which is that both Saudi Arabia and Iran do utilize sectarianism in their engagement in the Syria conflict. They do back different quote-unquote sectarian fighters at different times. But it's not the only thing they do, and indeed frequently it's not the first thing that they do. And what I'm trying to put forward in this paper, amongst other things I've written, is a slight nuancing of our understanding of these two actors' engagement with sectarianism in the Syria conflict. So the broad question that I ask is, how important have sect-based identities been in Saudi Arabia and Iran's sponsorship of fighting groups in the Syria conflict? And again, like I say, the context for this is this generalization that's frequently made that both of these actors are sectarian, and therefore their engagement in the conflict is sectarian. And it's based on this assumption that that's what they, when a conflict breaks out like in Syria, they both immediately reach into their toolbox and grab sectarian proxy war as their tool to further their interests. And actually, my hypothesis it's built on some other work I've done before, is that actually backing sectarian fighters or fighters that are based on a sect-based identity is not either Iran or Saudi Arabia's first choice. They often come to it after backing other actors in the conflict who at least ostensibly are more inclusive and not overtly sectarian. It's often when those methods fail that they turn to sectarianism. And so this is the idea of sectarianism being on their menu. It's an option they can turn to. It's like a reliable dish that they can fall back on if the thing they tried doesn't really turn out the way they liked. And indeed, it's something they do fall back on, especially Iran, but it isn't always their policy option, and it isn't always their automatic choice, and that's important. And actually, as I'll discuss, both show quite a lot of pragmatism and expediency in selecting their engagement with the conflict and the groups that they sponsor. They don't just automatically go to sort of the sectarian option. So a little bit about where this sits within sort of my research and sort of scholarship in general. It builds on a paper that Morten Valbjørn and I published in 2018, as well as a smaller paper I wrote for SEPAD in the same year. And it's also the foundation of a chapter that I'm writing. Sorry, Simon, it's still late, for an edited volume that Simon and Ed Wasnage are putting together later this year. And I suppose it comes from sort of two positions. Firstly, it feeds into this broader discussion that I think the SEPAD project is very much a supporter of, about nuancing our understanding of sectarianism as a phenomenon, moving away from these kind of old debates of, you know, is it top down or bottom up? Is it primordial or modern, ancient or modern identities, you know, internal, external actors? I'm trying to move away from that and contribute to a more subtle understanding of what might be taking place, especially with regard to external actors in the question of sectarianism. It also builds on existing literature on the Syria conflict and the role of external actors, including my own. And you know, I will be the first to hold up my hands and say, I not so much made a mistake, but some of my earlier research on the Syria conflict and the external actors didn't sort of made a kind of made a sort of automatic assumption about the role of external actors with sectarianism, which is that this assumption that's made that because you can see a link between the presence of sectarian actors in the Syria conflict and a degree of sponsorship of those actors by foreign powers, that therefore those foreign powers must have thought of this from the beginning and automatically gone to that, you know, way of thinking, to think, all right, so for example, for Iran automatically must think, right, you know, how do we mobilize Shia or Alawis to fight, you know, in this conflict? And actually, you know, if you look more closely at the conflict, that's not really what's happened. And I think that's a false assumption made by scholars, including myself, when looking at the Syria crisis. Actually, if you look in more depth, like I said, this has not been their first option. It's often been, you know, turning to sect-based fighters has occurred when backing non-sectarian or more nationally based groups has failed. Even when sectarian fighters are utilized, it's usually alongside and not instead of less sectarian actors. So it's kind of something operating in parallel, not, you know, oh, fine, those guys have failed, let's move to someone else. And also you do see examples of these external sponsors trying to moderate some of the tone, some of the language of their ostensibly sectarian groups that they're sponsoring. So sort of moving on to, you know, how I want to illustrate this. I'm going to in a moment talk about Saudi Arabia and Iran individually, but the starting point is, I suppose, the big caveat, which, you know, both of these actors have sponsored sectarian fighters, and I'm not saying for a moment they have not done so. And if you look at the course of the conflict, notwithstanding the very important points made by Ugur about the you know, how we actually understand what is mobilizing these different militia groups, and perhaps we shouldn't, you know, use this term sectarian militia because that isn't necessarily an accurate description of what is motivating these groups. That said, I think we can still point to certain groups that have been sponsored by both Saudi Arabia and Iran and say, you know, there is clearly a sectarian element to their mobilization, and that element is being utilized by Saudi Arabia or Iran to form some kind of link and justify their sponsorship. So in Saudi Arabia, the most obvious was the fact that Saudi eventually backed a quite overtly sectarian Sunni Islamist group, Jaish al-Islam, who are based in Douma in Damascus, drawing on links with their founder and leader Zahran Aloush, whose father had links to Saudi Arabia. But as well as that, at earlier points in the war, they were turning a blind eye to private sponsorship of quite radical Sunni sectarian fighting groups inside the Syrian opposition. And they similarly did very little to clamp down on some of the rhetoric that was coming out of Saudi Arabia's private media and some preachers as well that were very much, taking a sectarian tone about the conflict. It's even more obvious when you look at Iran. Iran has clearly sort of backed sectarian actors, most obviously sending foreign sectarian actors into Syria. That included, a large number of Hezbollah fighters from Lebanon, Afghani and Pakistani fighters, the Mayun and Zainabiyun groups, large numbers, tens of thousands being sent into Syria. And a lot of really good work has been done by scholars on this, looking at the use of language these militia have utilized, the kind of rhetoric, the kind of anti-Sunni, the kind of anti-Takfiri language that is utilized by these groups. And it's relatively, clean cut to call, to say they've got a sectarian element to them. As well as that, Major General Qasem Soleimani was sent over by the IRGC Quds Force, who played a very strong, dominant role in Syria's war effort. That included retraining some of these Shabiha groups that Ugur was talking about earlier. Some of these units were sort of, mobilized around sect-based identities, and sort of the loose knock-on effect of that as a whole. A lot of people have written about this, about how it played a role in radicalizing some Syrian Sunni opposition group fighters, seeing these quite radical foreign Shia come in, galvanize those that were arguing for a more sectarian interpretation of the conflict. Again, I've written, as have many other people, and again, Ali's point was very clear on this, that you do not see sectarian conflict across the Syrian civil war. It is often quite localized in certain areas. There are whole parts of the conflict that don't take a sectarian nature whatsoever. However, it is clearly possible to draw some line of causality, or at least inflammation of sectarian tension with it, where it is found in the conflict, being linked to the presence of either foreign fighters or foreign sponsored fighters of a more sectarian nature. But that said, if we look in more depth at actually what Saudi Arabia and Iran has done, it is not quite so straightforward. And in both cases, you see an evolution of their policies. They don't initially reach for the sectarian tool in their box. Saudi Arabia especially is really cautious early on. In the first couple of years of the conflict, from the crisis through to 2011 through 2013, they really, even though the sectarian narrative coming out of their media and sometimes even their government spokespeople, when it comes to sponsoring foreign fighters, they're much keener on groups they consider moderate, unsectarian, preferably former army officers. So they sponsor the moderate Free Syrian Army group early on. And they're unlike Qatar and Turkey, who seem far more liberal in their sponsorship of different groups, some of whom are quite Islamist, many of whom are linked to the Muslim Brotherhood, the Ikhwan. Saudi Arabia really, as we know, does not like the Muslim Brotherhood and really is worried about Islamists. And so its preference early on is to support secular former Syrian army officers who have defected within the Free Syrian Army. And it's only when those groups fail, when they don't succeed, when it's quite clear by around mid-2013 that these secular former army officers are not going to defeat Assad, that under Prince Bandar in Saudi, who is has the Syria brief at the time, they begin to turn to more sectarian actors, and in particular they forge this relationship with the Salafist Jaish al-Islam. But even then, they don't stop their support for the probably the most secular Free Syrian Army group, the Southern Front around the Dara Badia area. They continue that sponsorship all the way through to 2017. Again, you know, showing this parallel track. They're not abandoning non-sectarian actors. They're just sort of co-sponsoring others. And even then, when they sponsor Jaish al-Islam, they actively encourage Jaish al-Islam to moderate their slogans. So a lot of the early language that Jaish al-Islam, especially Zahran Alouche, says it is very anti-Rafidi, anti-Shia, you know, in its language. And there's a conscious effort to tone that down to the point that actually Jaish al-Islam ultimately come to join the mainstream opposition group, and they really moderate their slogans to be more inclusive. So what I would conclude from that about Saudi Arabia is you clearly see a degree of, you know, pragmatism involved there. You know, there's a degree of fear themselves that they have about Islamists, and especially the Ikhwan. They don't want to sponsor them. But also perhaps there's this pragmatic component of what's going to work in Syria. Actually, if you go for like a hard Sunni sectarian narrative in a multi-faith, multi-ethnic state like Syria, you're probably not going to win over enough people to your cause. So what you're broadly seeing from the Saudi policy is not this kind of immediate reach for sectarianism as a tool, but they don't, you know, but a real reluctance to go for that. And even when they do, they still don't put all their eggs in one basket. They try to moderate those Salafist slogans, especially the sectarian ones, and also back other groups. That doesn't mean that they're not still sort of sectarian in outlook. They might well be, but it just shows that doesn't necessarily lead to a quote unquote sectarian policy when it comes to backing backing fighters in Syria. And something similar happens in Iran, actually, with Iran. So Iran starts its it starts its sorry, I've gone too far. There we go. Hang on. This is where I get it all wrong. There we go. So it does not immediately send these foreign Shia fighters into Syria. Its first policy is to back Assad's army. It sends, you know, Quds Force advisors to help Assad's army. It sends Quds Force advisors to help them. It doesn't immediately go for that approach, and it's only when the Syrian Arab army fails and isn't doing well that Qasem Soleimani goes to Damascus himself, and he sort of starts bringing in Hezbollah and Shia militia from Iraq, Afghanistan, and Pakistan. There's a great quote of Qasem Soleimani in 2013 where he says, "The Syrian army is useless. Give me one brigade of the besieged, you know, and I'd conquer the entire country." You know, and this again points to a degree of pragmatism. You know, he's not saying I need the besieged because, you know, they are ideologically aligned in a way that the Syrian Arab army, which is a more national entity, isn't. But because he knows them, he's worked with them, he's trained them. You know, he brings over the militia he trained, worked with against the Americans in Iraq. There's a degree of pragmatism there, you know, this loyal entity that he can work with that will get the job done. But again, same caveat as with the Saudis, even when they do that, they don't abandon their support for the Syrian Arab army. They bring in these militia alongside these, you know, Assad's supposedly secular army. And of course, even though there are elite divisions that are dominated by one particular religious group, the Alawis within the army, it's still ostensibly very much a national entity. It has national symbols. It doesn't, you know, it doesn't speak the kind of sectarian language that some of these Shia militia do. Likewise, when they create, and it was mentioned by both Ali and Ugur, when the Iranians helped create the National Defense Forces, this is not, even though there are some sect-based militia within it, it is still framed within a national language. It is not a shifting towards a overtly sectarian kind of approach. And again, I would suggest there's a degree of expediency here. You know, the demographics won't work, even if Iran wanted to adopt a wholly sectarian language. You simply don't have the numbers on your side to make that work. In somewhere like Iraq, where, and again, I'm not saying it does work in Iraq, but hypothetically, with 60% of the population being Shia, you know, that kind of majoritarian approach might work. In Syria, it wouldn't. You know, the Shia are only 1 to 2% of the population, Alawis maybe 12% of the population, and I get Rahaf's point about the ambiguity of those statistics, but you know, even so, you know, you're going to be excluding key constituents, you know, Sunnis, Druze, Christians, if you adopt that kind of overtly sectarian language, which is why I suspect that Iran approach this dual track rather than a single point. Another point just to make, which I'm running out of time, so I'll have to cut it short, but expediency also shown more recently when Russia entered the conflict, and Russia really wanted to work with the Syrian military, the Syrian Arab army, and you've seen this kind of shift now where Iran has actually stepped back from the Syrian Arab army and it's doubled down on its militia. Again, some national militia, not all sectarian militia. But again, that is something that has been forced upon it by circumstance, by the Russians. You know, had the Russians not entered, there's no reason to suggest that the Iranians would have stopped working with the Syrian military or the Syrian army. That's something that's due to expedience and pragmatism rather than necessarily due to a kind of ideological opposition to working with a non-sectarian based entity. So hang on, final point just to conclude, where are we? Yeah, so just to reiterate, I think, you know, these groups, both Saudi Arabia and Iran, are not as sectarian in their policy towards sponsorship of fighting groups as many people presume. They have backed sectarian militia, but it's not always their first option. It's not exclusively sectarian groups, and they sometimes do try to moderate them. And I would argue this is primarily down to an expedient desire to secure victory rather than kind of ideological sect-based zeal. So, like I say, you know, using sect-based fighters is on their menu. It's something they often utilize, especially Iran, who has used it successfully, and it might be why they often go back to it. But it's only one of several tools that they will utilize. And a final point, just in terms of further research, I've looked at Saudi Arabia and Iran here, but one of the underexplored actors is Turkey. Turkey has actually played way more of a role with quote-unquote sectarian Sunni militia in this conflict than Saudi Arabia has, and yet Saudi is often like seen as a sectarian actor, whereas Turkey isn't. And I think that's a really interesting area to explore. I'm sorry, Simon, I've totally gone over my time. Apologies.
I'll let you off just this once, Chris. So as I did a quick shill for Ugur's book, when is your next issue of the Battle of Syria due to come out?
So sadly, the third edition, because this war is still sadly ongoing, is out in the late summer.
Fantastic. Well, it is very tragic, but it has meant that we've been able to read some of your fantastic scholarship. So I'm not going to say silver lining, but find little bits of optimism where we can. Okay, we have a range of absolutely fascinating and provocative questions. So what I will do is I've sifted through them. I have questions for each of the panelists, and then after asking one question to each of you, I've got a question that I think might provoke a bit of debate amongst you all. So we'll go with this, if I may. We'll start with you, Ugur. This is a question from Elizabeth Surkov, who says, could you explain a little bit about the Hashiba who you interviewed justify themselves and others their actions? Do they claim that the civilians they murdered were terrorists? To what extent do you think that the Shahiba, NDF/LDF at this stage of the conflict in Syria are basically criminal networks as opposed to military units fighting along front lines? And why were they willing to talk?
Okay, well, thank you very much, Elizabeth and Simon, for paraphrasing the question. Three, I think, excellent questions. I'll try to be very brief, starting with the justification of how do they justify their violence. And I think this is absolutely key. If there's one thing that this entire project tried to understand is motives for violence. Why commit this violence? What is the meaning that they ascribe to the violence that they commit? And I think there were several things. One, they all interestingly pointed out the legitimacy of the state and the illegitimacy of the uprising. So that's one important thing. Second interesting thing that I thought was kind of ironic is they would point to Iraq and say, well, do you want Syria to become like Iraq? So there's a type of nightmare future doom scenario that they would want to avert, and they would want to avert that by committing sectarian violence. to prevent sectarian violence. So an interesting kind of paradox. And one of the central arguments of the paramilitarism book, and to some extent also in the Shabiha book, is plausible deniability. You know, these type of militias, they are created, or they're allowed to emerge tacitly, condoned by the various networks within the intelligence, to create a certain distance between the state, the official state, and the crimes and the violence that's occurring, that they commit on the ground. And I think that's absolutely key. Second point about criminal networks, yes. I mean, in the book on paramilitarism, I have a whole chapter actually on the role of organized crime, because civil war in itself is criminogenic. It creates all types of opportunities for all types of internal, external, cross-border crime, and the Shabiha are up to their neck in this, involved in these forms like drug smuggling, for example, or ransom, or a checkpoint economy and whatnot, and vice versa. Interestingly, some Shabiha were criminals, habitual criminals, petty criminals, big-time criminals before the conflict, and the regime actually picked them out of prison and cleansed their record by having them enlist in the NDF or in the militias. And finally, why were they willing to talk? That's a very long conversation. I'm willing to have that at some point, but it's that's a long discussion about methodology of how to gain trust of people. And I think trust networks. I mean, this is the key. I think the key issue here, and patience.
Great, thank you. It's interesting that you say, Ugur, that in conversations with Syrians, they point to, or officials point to Iraq and say, do you want to be like that? In interviews that I did with folks across the Gulf just after the Arab uprisings, they pointed to Syria and say, do you want to be like that? So there's this sort of this transferable point that that is being made, I think, by different people depending on their context. Okay, Rahaf, let's move on to you, please. This is a question from Zenia Yunus. Apologies if I mispronounce anything. Rahaf, you mentioned in the beginning of your presentation that you noticed that you yourself used two different approaches to language with Syrians and within your academic work. I do find that really interesting, and our role as researchers are crucial to put forward. I'm curious though, how would you describe your own interactions with other people from Syria in terms of wordings or framing of the conflict? Where are the main differences between your background and your researcher role? And do these differences reflect what you have found in the research? Over to you, Rahaf.
Well, thank you very much for this question. Well, to start with, actually, answering this question pretty much links to what Ugur was saying about the justification of violence, and this brings us to the Syrian national identity that has been hardened. I mean, and in my opinion, in the last, we do think that the binary that we see here is not Sunni Shia or Sunni Alawi, but rather Baathi or non-Baathi, or Assadist or non-Assadist. And I think this is pretty much links to how I see my positionality, whether outside research and when I'm writing my research. So, for example, we don't express our sectarian identity. We never did, we Syrians, and I'm sure like many Syrians do share with me that we are not really so the kind of the sectarian framework does not come into the Syrian identity that has been for the last 40 years. But I mean, so for example, when I'm in groups with Syrians, if they are like, they have the Ramadi or the gray kind of thinking about what is going on, so we will use Azme, Ahdath, or crisis events. And this pretty much links to, if you read the literature or the scholarship on Lebanon, there has been a kind of amnesia of remembering the events. So they call it not the Lebanese civil war, they call it the events, the ahdath. And this is pretty much how, so it depends on the audience or who I'm speaking to. So we say ahdath, crisis, azme, war, maybe conflict. And when it comes to my research, and I had many debates with Syrian friends, and this is personal, where if I write the word uprisings, and I do use uprisings rather than revolution, because I believe that it is ongoing. This struggle is something ongoing and has not finished. So if you say revolution, then this is something that has changed, and like we realize this change. And so we do, so for Syrians, it's very something emotional, personal, and sentimental if you say uprising rather than revolution. Till now, I have not had like an issue because my data is all not with, I'm not dealing with, my methodology with my research is not to do with one-to-one. So till now, I have not had this issue to like kind of interact with my positionality, but I do talk about my positionality in every paper that I publish because it does take, I mean, it says a lot about your findings and your approach and so on and so forth. I hope I answered your question.
I think so. I think you've raised some really interesting points there. And I would say that if the panelists are willing, then perhaps attendees can get in touch via email or social media to pick up on some of these points at a later date, given that they are so rich and so complex in terms of the issues that are at play. Ali, I have a question for you from Amani Salim. Thank you for your presentation. How does class play into the structures of the Shahiba at Aleppo University? Is it reduced to economic incentives?
Actually, it would be unfair to reduce all the motivations or incentives into economic ones, because if you look at the structure of Aleppo or the approach Hafiz al-Assad and Bashar follow in Aleppo is the in Arabic it's called taryif debat, or the making the countryside prevails over the cities, because Assad himself is from the countryside. So we see this rivalry between the countryside and the city. If we look at it statistically and even kind of at the structure of the or at the senior members of the Ba'ath, you see most of them are from the countryside. So this is to keep the balance, because Aleppo is the economic capital of the country. So businessmen depend on or use money to have leverage or to gain leverage into the security apparatus and the government, while the Reef, the countryside, would use their position inside the Ba'ath. So it is about leverage and access to power. And even statistically, if you look at the Shabiha members inside Aleppo or inside Aleppo University, you would see more. The majority are from the countryside, not from the city. Most of those who are from the city have left the country or have paid ransom to be exempted from the military conscription, etc. So it is rather about power, and then you will have other factors like economic or power or access to power, but not economic incentives per se.
Thank you very much, Ali. So following this logical flow, Chris, a question for you from Francesco, a question for Dr. Chris. Seems to me that in regard to the process you're describing, Hersey and Iran are following a different approach. i.e. Iran uses sectarian militias early but has a broader interest, brackets regional, rather only in Syria, not to corner itself into a narrow sectarian picture, brackets, so rhetoric is not sectarian. Saudi Arabia, on the other hand, initially just goes for what they find on the ground, so defectors and later Islamists, but has no problem pandering a sectarian rhetoric. If so, does this difference depend on Iran constantly needing to take into account its Shia Persianness in a region where they are in a demographic minority? So sectarianism can be useful in a conflict, but risky in the broader region. over to you.
I see Francesco has also just written, sorry, long question at the bottom. It's fine, Francesco. It's great. Interesting question. So I think you're right in that I'm probably drawing out the similarities without pointing out the differences. They are clearly doing things quite differently. And a lot of that is about capacity and experience. I'm not 100% sure. It's obviously the identity factors feed into that because that's what your capacity is. And you're right that Iran, has this potential narrow base if it only focuses on Shia identity, because obviously the number of Shias in the region are relatively limited, and it's always pitched itself since the Islamic Revolution as speaking on behalf of the entire Islamic world, not just sort of the Shia Islamic world. So there is that component to it. But I think the capacity and experience dimension is also really important in explaining their different behaviors. To put it bluntly, Iran is just better at this. It's been doing it more, and it's been doing it for longer. So, when the Syria crisis started going wrong, it looked at what it could do. So it initially, sort of when Syria crisis first began, it just backed the Assad government loosely, offered some advice, but broadly speaking, it was like, if you need money, we can do that. We suggest you do this. Actually, interestingly, Assad did not follow the initial advice. The initial advice from Iran was, don't go around killing loads of people in the streets. It'll just lead to a snowball effect. Instead, you should do what we did with the Green Revolution in 2009, which is identify key leaders and arrest them, but leave everyone else alone. But that was ignored. When things started going wrong, then the Iranians say, right, okay, what tools have we got? Well, what worked before? Well, Shia militia, that worked in Iraq against the Americans. It worked in in Lebanon with Hezbollah against the Israelis. This is a tried and tested formula. Let's try to export that to Syria. And obviously, conditions in Syria were different. The state was stronger than it was in either Iraq or Lebanon. They had to work with the existing structures to an extent, but they had got, going back to my menu analogy, they had got that kind of strong, reliable dish on the menu that they could sort of pull off. The Saudis, you're absolutely right, do not have that experience, though ironically they thought that they did. They thought that their experience of running Mujahideen in Afghanistan in the 1980s was equivalent to this, which is one of the reasons they appointed Bandar to be the point man on Syria, because he had been one of the point men on Afghanistan in the 80s. But if you think about their menu, it's a little bit more like one of those kind of French country restaurants where they just serve what they're cooking on the day, rather than having sort of this well printed thing. And they're literally just, like you say, scrabbling around. What can we do? We'll go with that. So it ends up being similar to Iran in terms of sort of process, but the way they got there was really quite different, and to me, a lot of that is based on a really limited capacity and experience from the Saudi Arabians in contrast to the Iranians.
Chris, we've picked up on this in various other fora, but it strikes me that there's a bit of a proactive, reactive dimension to what's happening, and that the Iranians are being proactive in terms of a particular vision for regional ordering, and the Saudis are somewhat reactive. But I think that's probably something to reflect on at another time, rather than just focusing on Syria. But it struck me that it might be something that people might want to think about. I have a question here from Oliver Mitzi. Again, apologies if I have badly mispronounced your name. Sorry, Oliver. This is a question to all of you, and I'm quite curious to see where the panelists take this, because I think it can go in a range of different ways. The question is for everyone, and Oliver says this: given the Assad regime is winning the war, and assuming he eventually wins, can a post-conflict Syria repair its social fabric when it's been torn apart by actors that have employed sectarian discourse to battle a regime or various opposition factions, depending on participants, and committed gross human rights violations on sectarian lines? How does Syrian society repair itself? He adds, when the regime controls the country, but I think, how does it repair itself in a post-conflict setting? So who would like to kick off? It's such a broad and complex question that requires probably transitional justice and lots of other factors. But Rahaf, I saw you have unmuted yourself.
Well, yes, okay. I will start, I mean, thanks, Oliver, for this question. So I'll start with putting within brackets winning. What is winning anyway? Or what is stable? Or are we in a mythical stability or whatever? And I think this brings us to the beginning of all about this process of desectarianization, and whether we are really in front of is the regime really, like, I mean, especially if we see the regime's rhetoric, they have never used sectarian language. They have never sectarianized their language, but rather they were always capitalized on terrorism and extremism to win national unity. And actually, so this brings us that we need to focus on de-essentializing the religiosity of the Syrian communities. So if Assad is staying in power, I don't think that the problem is how these, between brackets, sectarian communities are living together, but how the regimes is using certain modes or a certain ideological modes to stability. And here we need to deconstruct the modes that Assad has been using, the ideological tools that he has been using to stay in power. So it's not only religion, or it's not he is using the sectarian structure of the army or the secret apparatus. This is not making him winning, but rather certain ideological co-optation that is within Syria is doing. And this goes with the construction or with the internalization of certain national identity that Syrians has been growing with for the last 40 years. So the binary here is Assadist and non-Assadist. The loyalty is built on to be with the regime, and with being and synonymizing with the regime, it means stability and national unity, rather than with being against the regime is like chaos, or Lebanon, the Lebanese civil war, or Iraq. So, and I think this is the focus that, I mean, how we envision this after, if Assad is staying, is by looking and de-essentializing that it's not, these are not sectarian communities, but there is a certain ideological tools that has been used to produce political subjectivities, or to induce compliance, or to induce acceptance. And we should actually critique the concept of consent and the concept of legitimacy, and how this has been like propagated from the regime, and what the tools that the regime has been using to induce acceptance or consent or legitimacy within Syria. There are different modes whatsoever. Yeah.
Thanks, Rahaf. Does anyone else want to build on that? Ugur.
Yeah, I think it's a terrific question. It's an important question. I think also it's a question that can only be really answered in comparative perspective. So, I mean, my short answer to that, and my pessimistic answer to that is no. I mean, the violence that has been seen, that Syria has witnessed in these 9 years, is so incredibly damaging, and I think also irreversibly damaging to society and coexistence, that it's going to be impossible to return to whatever was normalcy. I do think that there are ways forward through transitional justice, but I think there are several factors that complicate it. One is, first of all, this was a social media war. There are over 2 million videos of this conflict, including some video clips that many of us have seen of exceptionally gruesome violence, killings and beheadings and sexual violence and whatnot. These records, they exist forever. How do you explain that to future generations? Right. So I'm exceptionally pessimistic about it. More, for example, about Syria than about another conflict that I've studied, which is Yugoslavia, for example. Now, even if you look at cases in which there's very significant transitional justice and reparations, for example, between Germany and Israel, is the relationship between Germans and Jews ever going to be normal? I don't think so. And that is in the kind of the best case scenario. Forget about the long aftermath that we haven't even seen yet of the type of violence against civilians that we've seen in Syria. So, unfortunately, I'm going to be very, very pessimistic on this question.
Sure, thank you, Ugur. Chris and Ali. Chris, I saw your hand first, so Ali, sorry.
No, let Ali go first.
Okay, Ali.
Okay, thanks a lot, Chris. So I would like also to second Ugur on his point, and now talking to to Syrians, to perpetrators and victims, they always draw on the past experience. They always talk about the 80s, what happened during the 80s, and how the regime kind of was criminalizing everyone that he suspects of being activist. And just an example of the Mustafa Khalifa book or work on it, The Shell. He's a Christian and a non-religious person who was imprisoned in Palmyra, in Tadmor prison, with the accusation of belonging to the Islamic Brotherhood. So you see the also the politicization or the securitization of activism. So I think we have a lot of examples. Just to mention one, the notorious Issam Zahruddin, who's a notorious figure, who was threatening those who left the country, and he said, don't come back, like, from my beard, take it from my beard, which is saying, like, in Syria. So it's a promise. If you come back, we will execute you. You will be punished. And I think all parties to the conflict have kind of reflected or kind of taken a step back to reflect on what has been happening, except the regime. The regime is still very consistent and also insisting on eliminating or kind of confronting any future return or those who revolted against the regime. So this is the revenge factor is still key in the regime rhetoric and narrative. So this is just like brief examples of still ongoing broadcasting.
Thanks, Ali. Chris.
Yeah, I mean, I'm conscious, very much, as an outsider making sort of pronouncements on whether or not Syrian society will be able to knit itself back together or not. So perhaps I'll echo what Ugur was saying by looking at comparisons rather than particularly the Syrian case. I think that I have a slightly, fractionally more optimistic view than Ugur, looking at those comparisons, and that's simply just by looking at the long view. In that, my assessment would be you can't have transitional justice without a transition, and there's not going to be a transition, along this line. The regime is going to remain in power in some capacity. And what tends to happen in other civil wars and instances like that, when the incumbent wins, you get a very long period of basically keeping your head downness, where effectively a whole generation. And in fact, it's funny, Ali talked about that. That's really what happened in the 80s and early 90s in Syria, as well as I understand it. And it's when the next generation comes of age that people begin to reinterrogate, those past incidences. So sort of, Ugur talked about the Germany, Israel example. You did get that whole wave in the 1960s of sort of a new generation of Germans, like, doing trials of sort of Nazi war criminals again, sort of, really interrogating what their parents had done in the war. We begin to see it, interestingly, in Spain only now. After the fall of Franco, is there really that kind of reconsideration of that time, decades later? And so my optimism is the next generation, which is, and you could even make an argument, and it's a very spurious one, but I'm going to make it anyway, that maybe part of the 2011 uprising in Syria was part of a new generation who didn't remember Hama, who didn't remember sort of the 80s, and had come of age later on and thought that they could sort of move things forward, and actually were horrified to discover that wasn't the case and things hadn't changed. But, you know, logic would suggest, and looking at, you know, parallels elsewhere, that the next generation will probably find themselves in a similar situation. So I wouldn't say never, but that said, you know, if the question is about, you know, what's going to happen in the next 5 or 10 years under an Assad regime, I imagine it will be keep your head downedness and not really sort of, you know, having those difficult discussions and conversations just yet. More's the pity.
Thank you, Chris. Yeah, I think there's some really interesting points there, particularly on the note of comparisons. There's generational dimensions to conflict in a number of the places that Chris has mentioned. I think Northern Ireland is one that shows that there is perhaps a degree of hope, although questions about when the incumbent wins makes that all the more complex and all the more delicate. I think this is where ideas and questions about desectarianization are obviously important, which can take place in myriad forms, including if there is a transition, but also if there isn't a transition and the incumbent remains in power. There can be a desectarianization or a desecuritization of identities, which may go some way into trying to erode some of the structural frustrations that have built up over time. But of course, memory and structural grievances remain, and they are far trickier to address. I guess, given that we are rapidly running out of time, that depressing note is where we must end it for today. But I just want to say a couple of things before we do. First of all, thank you, a huge thank you to Rahaf, Ali, Ugur, and Chris for joining us today. It's been a fantastic session, really provocative, really, really rich in conceptual, empirical detail, and it's been fascinating. So thank you so much. A huge thank you to everyone for joining us from across the world. We've got people from New York, we've got people from in India, across Europe. So thank you everyone for joining us. A huge thank you to Carnegie Corporation for continuing to support SEPAD in everything that we're doing. We really appreciate all of that support. Hillary and Nihal, thank you so much. I hope you're staying safe in New York. And please do come along to tomorrow's session, which is on desectarianization. Same time, same place. Do register if you're interested. Otherwise, Elias will not let you access the room because we're trying to keep it safe from Zoom pirates. So thank you so much, everyone. Take care, stay safe, and hope to see some